Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The Monte Verde estate was bathed in golden sunlight, its sprawling vineyards stretching to the horizon like a painting brought to life. This was my masterpiece. A high-profile wedding planned to perfection, every detail choreographed with precision. The air buzzed with excitement, the kind of energy that comes with love and endless possibilities. I should have felt invincible. Instead, there was a gnawing unease in the back of my mind, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "Alex, they're here." Lila's voice pulled me back to the moment. She stood at the entrance of the estate, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon light, a warm smile gracing her lips. My wife, beautiful, poised, and every bit the perfect partner for someone like me, a man whose career demanded appearances. Together, we were an image of success. Yet, as I walked toward her, there was something distant in her gaze, a flicker of detachment that I'd started to notice more often. The bride and groom, along with their entourage, spilled out of a fleet of luxury SUVs, laughter and excitement following them. As I greeted them and began orchestrating the welcome, a new presence caught my attention. "Ethan, over here!" one of the bridesmaids called, waving toward the back of the group. He emerged with a camera slung casually over his shoulder, moving with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Tall, with sharp cheekbones and an easy smile, Ethan looked like he belonged in front of the camera rather than behind it. He wore his charm like armor, disarming everyone in his path, and the way his eyes scanned the crowd made it clear he was always looking for his next subject or conquest. "Ethan Cross," he introduced himself, extending a hand toward me. His grip was firm, and his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Alex Greer. Thanks for coming on board," I replied. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, flashing a grin. "Weddings like this? They're art." I nodded politely, but something about him set me on edge. I chalked it up to stress. Managing high-profile clients always came with its share of pressure. Lila appeared at my side, her presence a calming counterbalance, as she always had been. She extended her hand to Ethan, who took it with a warmth that seemed excessive for a first meeting. "Lila," she said, "my husband has told me all about you. We're excited to see your work." Ethan's smile widened. "The pleasure's all mine. I've heard great things about both of you. You two make quite the team." Something about the way he said it made me bristle. His gaze lingered on Lila a beat too long, but she seemed oblivious, already shifting focus back to the guests. I shook off the unease, turning my attention to the tasks at hand. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. The ceremony rehearsals, the extravagant dinner under the stars, the endless details that needed my attention. Everything moved like clockwork. Ethan was everywhere, capturing candid moments with an artistry I couldn't deny. His charm made him a hit with the guests, and I began to wonder if I had misjudged him. Still, there were moments that gnawed at me, like when I spotted him talking to Lila near the pool during the cocktail hour. She was laughing, her posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. Or when he offered to take a portrait of us, his hand lingering on hers as he adjusted her pose. Each incident was minor, fleeting, but they stacked together, forming a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. Late one evening, after the guests had retired, I found Lila on the terrace, staring out at the moonlit vineyard with a glass of wine in her hand. I stepped behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist. "You've been quiet," I said, my voice low. She leaned into me but didn't reply immediately. "It's just a lot," she finally said. "These weddings take so much energy, you know?" I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. "You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything okay?" She turned in my arms, her eyes meeting mine with a softness that made me ache. "Of course. I'm fine, Alex. You worry too much." Her words were reassuring, but the kiss she placed on my cheek felt distant. I told myself it was the stress of the event, for both of us. After all, we'd built a life together on trust, hadn't we? The wedding day arrived, a symphony of perfection that unfolded under my watchful eye. Ethan was in his element, darting between moments like a predator stalking prey. When the bride and groom shared their first kiss, I caught Lila watching Ethan instead of the couple. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. By the time the night ended and the last guest had gone, I was too drained to confront my feelings. But as I lay awake beside Lila in our suite, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Something had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I told myself I was imagining things, that my stress was clouding my judgment. Yet deep down I knew this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to control. The following weeks flew by in a blur of deadlines and meetings. Returning to normalcy after the Monteverde wedding should have been a relief, but something had shifted. I could feel it in the quiet moments at home when Lila and I sat in the same room but felt miles apart. Work offered little respite. High-profile clients demanded my full attention, leaving me little time to address the unease growing between us. I told myself it was temporary, that life would smooth itself out as it always had. But even as I buried myself in the next event, I couldn't forget Ethan Cross. Lila seemed to think about him often too, though she hid it well. I catch her scrolling through social media, stopping a little too long on the photos Ethan had taken at the Monteverde wedding. When I entered the room, she'd quickly swipe past, offering a vague explanation about looking for inspiration. Her laughter had become rare, and when it came, it sounded different, forced, like a fragile echo of the past. One Friday evening, we found ourselves at home with no obligations. It had been weeks since we'd spent time together like this, just the two of us. I cooked dinner, a simple pasta dish, while she lingered in the living room with a glass of wine. I could hear the faint hum of music from her phone, a playlist she always played when she wanted to relax. "Smells good," she said as she wandered into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. She wore a soft sweater that hung loosely over her frame, her bare feet padding against the tile floor. It was a picture of intimacy, yet it felt foreign, like she was playing a role she no longer believed in. "Figured we could use a quiet night," I replied, stirring the sauce. "It's been a while." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's nice. Feels normal." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I held back. Instead, I plated the food, and we sat at the small table by the window. The conversation was light, drifting from work to plans for the weekend. For a moment, it felt like we were reconnecting, the distance between us shrinking. Then her phone buzzed, shattering the illusion. She glanced at the screen, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. My heart sank. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She nodded, quickly setting the phone face down on the table. "Just a friend checking in." I forced a smile, but my appetite was gone. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. After dinner, she disappeared into the bedroom while I stayed behind to clean up. Her phone sat on the counter where she'd left it, the screen dark and silent. I stared at it for a long moment, a storm of emotions brewing inside me. The next day, Lila suggested we spend some time apart. "Just to recharge," she said, her tone light. "You've been working so hard, and I've got errands to run. It'll do us both good." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. I spent the afternoon at the office, catching up on paperwork and pretending the quiet didn't bother me. But the nagging suspicion followed me like a shadow. By the time I returned home that evening, Lila was already there, her mood noticeably brighter. "Good day?" I asked as I set my keys on the counter. She smiled, her cheeks flushed. "Yeah, it was nice to get out for a bit. How about you?" "Productive," I replied, though the weight in my chest felt anything but. That night, as she lay asleep beside me, I found myself replaying the events of the day. The way her mood had shifted, the brightness in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. I didn't want to believe there was someone else, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The next weekend, we attended a charity gala, one of those events where appearances mattered more than anything else. Lila looked stunning in a sleek black dress, her hair swept into an elegant updo. She was the picture of sophistication, the perfect complement to my tailored tuxedo. Yet, even in a room full of people, I felt alone. Midway through the evening, as I mingled with clients and industry contacts, I spotted her across the room. She stood near the bar, laughing at something someone had said. And then I saw him. Ethan. He was leaning against the bar, his posture casual yet magnetic. He had that same easy smile, the one that disarmed everyone in its path. Lila's hand rested lightly on her glass, her body angled toward him in a way that felt too intimate. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I excused myself from the conversation I was having and made my way toward them, my mind racing. When I reached the bar, Ethan turned to me, his smile unwavering. "Alex, good to see you again," he said, his tone overly friendly. Lila's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe? Or was it defiance? "I didn't know you'd be here," I said, forcing a tight smile. "Small world, huh?" Ethan replied, lifting his glass in a mock toast. Lila shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between us. "Ethan's doing some work for the charity. Isn't that great?" "Great," I echoed, though the word tasted bitter on my tongue. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I stayed close to Lila, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, piece by piece. That night, as we drove home in silence, I couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late to save us. The weeks following the charity gala were a slow burn of unease. Ethan's name seemed to hover in the air between Lila and me, unspoken yet ever-present. She'd become adept at brushing off questions about her day, and I, despite my growing doubts, clung to the hope that I was imagining things. But suspicion has a way of sharpening your senses, and soon I noticed patterns that were impossible to ignore. Lila's phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now glued to her side. Her evenings out grew more frequent, always explained with vague references to errands or meeting old friends. And then, there was her laughter, rare around me but freely given to the messages on her screen. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I started keeping track. The day she came home with her hair slightly mussed and her lipstick faintly smeared, claiming she'd met a friend for coffee, I made a mental note. When I caught a whiff of cologne on her scarf that wasn't mine, I tucked that away too. Each moment was a thread, and together they were weaving a story I wasn't ready to face. One Thursday evening, as I left the office later than usual, I decided to drive by the wine bar where Lila had said she'd be meeting a college friend. It was a small, upscale place we'd visited together once or twice. Her car was there, parked neatly in the lot. But when I stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit tables, I didn't see her. For a moment I felt relief. Maybe I was wrong. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of them. Lila was sitting in a corner booth, her back partially turned to me. Across from her was Ethan. He leaned in close, his body language casual but unmistakably intimate. She laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his as she reached for her glass. I felt frozen in place, my feet rooted to the ground as a wave of emotions crashed over me. Anger, betrayal, and a sickening sense of inevitability all fought for dominance. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the place for a confrontation. Not here, not like this. Instead, I turned and walked out, my mind racing. I wanted proof, and now I had it. But what was I supposed to do with it? The thought of confronting Lila made my stomach churn. Yet the alternative, pretending nothing was wrong, felt unbearable. The following morning I tried to act normal. I got up early, made coffee, and busied myself with work emails at the kitchen table. When Lila finally emerged, she looked tired but otherwise unbothered. She greeted me with a soft smile, and for a moment, I hated how effortlessly she could lie. "Late night?" I asked casually, watching her closely. She hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Yeah, it was good to catch up with Mia. It's been ages." "Mia." The lie landed so smoothly it made my chest ache. I forced a smile and nodded, pretending to believe her. But inside, the threads of my patience were unraveling. 2 days later, I found myself standing in the doorway of my friend Nathan's office. He was one of the few people I trusted implicitly, a steady presence who'd been by my side since college. He looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing as he took in my expression. "What's going on?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit. I closed the door behind me and sank into the chair opposite him. "I think Lila's having an affair," I said, the words heavy and bitter on my tongue. Nathan leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "What makes you say that?" I told him everything, the late nights, the secrecy, the lies, and then, finally, about Ethan. "I saw them together," I finished, my voice tight. "At the wine bar. It wasn't just friendly." Nathan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Have you talked to her about it?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I don't know how. I'm not even sure what I want to say." "You need to decide what you're looking for," Nathan said. "Closure? A confession? Or do you just want it to stop?" His words stuck with me long after I left his office. I replayed them over and over in my mind, trying to untangle the mess of emotions inside me. Did I want the truth, no matter how painful? Or was I clinging to the hope that this could all somehow be undone? That weekend, Lila suggested we have a date night. It was her idea, an olive branch of sorts, though I suspected it was more about easing her own guilt than reconnecting with me. Still, I agreed. Part of me hoped it would be enough to remind her of what we had, of who we were before Ethan. We went to our favorite Italian restaurant, the one where we'd celebrated anniversaries and milestones. The atmosphere was warm and familiar, the candlelight casting a soft glow over her face. For a while, it almost felt like old times. We laughed, shared stories, and lingered over dessert. But there was a distance between us that I couldn't bridge, a chasm that had been growing wider with each passing day. When we got home, she leaned against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for tonight. It was nice." "Yeah, it was," I replied, though the words felt hollow. She hesitated, as if she wanted to say more. But then she turned and disappeared into the bedroom. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The nights grew longer, and the tension between us became a living thing, pressing against the walls of our home. Lila was more elusive than ever, her explanations paper-thin and her gaze avoiding mine whenever I tried to meet it. Despite my growing suspicions, I couldn't bring myself to confront her outright. Part of me still clung to the hope that this was all a misunderstanding. Another part of me feared what would happen if I ripped away the veil. The breaking point came on a night when Lila told me she'd be working late. "The agency is pitching a new campaign," she said. Her tone as rehearsed as a script. "I'll be home by 10. She left in a rush, her perfume lingering in the air long after the door had closed behind her. I stared at the clock, the minutes ticking by with excruciating slowness. 10 o'clock came and went, and by midnight, I knew I couldn't sit still any longer. I grabbed my keys and drove, not entirely sure where I was going but certain of what I would find. It didn't take long. Her car was parked outside a boutique hotel downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and discreet staff. My stomach churned as I pulled into a spot across the street, the reality of the situation crashing down on me like a wave. I'd wanted proof, and now it was staring me in the face. I sat there for what felt like hours, the engine idling as my thoughts spiraled. Anger and heartbreak fought for dominance, each one threatening to consume me. Finally, I stepped out of the car, my feet moving as if propelled by some force beyond my control. The lobby was quiet, the kind of serene that only existed in places where secrets were meant to be kept. The receptionist glanced up as I entered, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in my expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, the elevator doors slid open, and there they were. Lila stepped out first, her hair slightly disheveled and her lips parted in a breathless smile. Ethan followed close behind, his hand brushing against the small of her back in a gesture that made my blood boil. For a moment, none of us moved. Lila's eyes widened as she saw me, her expression shifting from shock to guilt to something that looked almost like defiance. Ethan, on the other hand, simply raised an eyebrow, his casual arrogance intact. "Alex," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. The words were lodged in my throat, choking me as I struggled to process the scene in front of me. Finally, I turned and walked out, the sound of her calling my name fading into the background as I stepped into the night. That evening marked the beginning of a painful new reality. Lila didn't come home until the following morning, her explanations hollow and her apologies half-hearted. I listened in silence, my mind replaying the moment in the hotel lobby over and over again. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Alex. You have to believe me." But I couldn't. The image of her with Ethan was seared into my memory, a wound that refused to heal. I withdrew into myself, pouring my energy into work and avoiding her whenever possible. At night, we slept on opposite sides of the bed, the space between us a chasm that neither of us dared to cross. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Maybe it was the years we'd spent building a life together, or the faint hope that we could somehow find our way back to each other. Or maybe it was the simple truth that I didn't know how to let go. Weeks later, I found myself at another event, a fundraiser for one of my clients. Lila was there too, her role as my wife requiring her presence despite the strain between us. She looked stunning, as always, her dress hugging her curves in a way that turned heads. But her beauty felt like a weapon now, something that had been used to deceive me. Ethan was there too. He hovered at the edges of the room, his camera in hand and his eyes scanning the crowd. When our gazes met, he smirked, a subtle yet infuriating gesture that made my fists clench at my sides. As the evening wore on, I couldn't help but watch them. The way she laughed at his jokes, the way his hand brushed against hers when he passed her a drink. It was subtle, careful, but to me it was glaringly obvious. By the time the event ended, I was seething. Lila and I drove home in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. When we stepped inside, I finally let the anger spill over. "How long are you going to keep lying to me?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. She froze, her eyes wide. "Alex, don't," I snapped. "I saw you, Lila, at the hotel. With him. Do you think I'm stupid?" Her expression crumbled, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her composure. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I was too consumed by the betrayal, the sheer audacity of what she'd done. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what's wrong with me." Her words hit me like a slap. I stared at her, searching for some sign of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the partner I'd built a life with. But all I saw was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize anymore. "I can't do this," I said, my voice hollow. "Not anymore." And with that, I walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dim light of our kitchen, her sobs echoing behind me. After the night in the kitchen, a fragile routine emerged between Lila and me. It wasn't forgiveness, I wasn't sure I was capable of that, but it was survival. We coexisted in the same space, performing the roles of husband and wife for the sake of appearances. On the surface, things seemed functional, but underneath I could feel the rift widening. Lila tried to repair what was left of us. She suggested counseling, dinners, and small weekend getaways, but I brushed them off with excuses. I wasn't ready to confront my emotions in front of a stranger, nor could I stomach pretending everything was fine while memories of her betrayal replayed in my mind. She started working late more often, though this time, she told me about it in advance. "We're finishing up a major project," she'd say, her tone cautious. "It'll be late nights for a while, but I'll text you when I'm done." I'd nod, offering no argument, though deep down, I didn't believe her. I'd given up trying to track her movements. If she was still seeing Ethan, it was happening somewhere I couldn't reach, physically or emotionally. It was during one of those late nights that I ran into him again. I was out with a few colleagues, grabbing drinks after a particularly grueling day at work. The bar was crowded, the hum of conversation blending with the clinking of glasses. I was nursing my second whiskey when I saw him across the room, his camera bag slung over one shoulder. Ethan. He was alone, leaning against the bar as he scrolled through his phone. My pulse quickened, a mix of anger and adrenaline surging through me. For weeks, I'd imagined what I'd say if I ever got the chance to confront him. Now that he was here, just a few steps away, my thoughts jumbled together in a chaotic mess. Before I could talk myself out of it, I set my glass down and crossed the room. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "Alex," he said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Didn't expect to see you here. I didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk." He smirked, gesturing to an empty stool beside him. By all means. I didn't sit. Instead, I leaned in, keeping my voice low. "Whatever's going on between you and Lila, it ends now. Do you understand me?" Ethan's smirk widened, and he took a leisurely sip of his drink before responding. "You're assuming a lot, Alex. Maybe you should talk to your wife instead of coming after me." His casual tone ignited something inside me. My fists clenched at my sides, and for a moment, I considered throwing a punch. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only give him more satisfaction, more power over me. "Stay away from her," I said through gritted teeth. "This is your only warning." Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender. Message received. "But let's be honest, Alex. If she really wanted to end things, she would have by now." His words hit harder than any blow. I turned and walked away, my head pounding and my chest tight. By the time I got home, Lila was already in bed, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "You're home late," she said. I didn't reply. Instead, I went to the bathroom, shutting the door behind me as I leaned against the sink. The encounter with Ethan replayed in my mind, his smug smile and cutting words echoing in my ears. Over the next few weeks, my focus shifted. If Lila and Ethan were still seeing each other, I needed proof. Not for confrontation, I was past that, but for clarity. I needed to understand the scope of their betrayal, to see the whole picture before deciding my next move. I hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie, but it was the only way to get answers. The man I hired was discreet, experienced, and unfazed by my situation. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked during our initial meeting. "Confirmation," I said. "I need to know if it's still happening. Where, when, how often?" He nodded, jotting down notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "I'll get back to you within a week." The waiting was excruciating. Every time Lila left the house, my mind spiraled with possibilities. I scrutinized her every move, analyzing her tone, her words, her gestures. But no matter how closely I watched, I couldn't tell if she was lying or if I was simply too broken to trust her. When the investigator finally called, his report was concise and devastating. "They've been meeting at his studio downtown," he said. "Mostly during the day while you're at work. I've got photos, timestamps, the works. Do you want me to send them over?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to see the evidence, to confront the reality head-on. But another part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. I'd already made my decision. "No," I said finally. "That won't be necessary." As I hung up, a strange sense of calm washed over me. For the first time in months, I felt certain of what I needed to do. The next phase of this nightmare was about to begin, and I would face it on my terms. The cracks in my marriage, once small and almost invisible, had grown into gaping fissures. Every interaction with Lila felt like walking on glass. She made repeated attempts to apologize, to explain, to reconnect, but her words felt hollow. I couldn't unsee the betrayal or unfeel the weight of her choices. Ethan, however, seemed undeterred. Despite everything, he was still a presence in our lives. His photography business had become inexplicably intertwined with mine, thanks to his charm and professional connections. Clients loved his work, and severing ties with him would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. So he lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake, a reminder of everything I'd lost. It was during a corporate gala, one of those high-stakes events where my reputation was everything, that things took a darker turn. Ethan was there, of course, hired by the client to capture candid shots of the evening. I spotted him the moment I walked into the venue, his ever-present camera slung over his shoulder and his eyes scanning the crowd. When his gaze landed on me, he smirked, a smug expression that made my blood boil. I avoided him for most of the night, focusing on my responsibilities and trying to ignore the itch of his presence. But as the evening wore on, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Lila was there too. I hadn't expected her to attend. She'd said she wasn't feeling well. Yet there she was, dressed in a sleek black gown and looking entirely too comfortable. Ethan noticed her too. I watched as they exchanged glances across the room, subtle but unmistakable. My fists clenched at my sides, and it took every ounce of restraint I had to keep my composure. I knew I couldn't confront them here, not in front of clients and colleagues. But something had to give, and soon. It was well past midnight when I got home. Lila was already there, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I entered, her expression wary. "You didn't mention you were going to the gala," I said, my tone carefully neutral. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the glass. "I wasn't planning to, but I thought it might be good to show my face. Support you." "Support me?" I repeated, incredulous. "By spending the night exchanging looks with Ethan?" Her eyes widened. "Alex, it's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me, Lila. Not again." She set the glass down and stood, her posture defensive. "I wasn't lying. I didn't even speak to him tonight." "But you wanted to," I said bitterly. "It's written all over your face. Do you even realize how humiliating this is? For me? For us?" She flinched, but her defiance didn't waver. "I'm trying, Alex. I'm trying to fix this, but you won't let me. You're so angry, so determined to punish me, that you won't even give me a chance. Because you don't deserve one." I shot back, the words sharp enough to cut. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stay to watch her cry. I left the room, slamming the door behind me and retreating to the sanctuary of my office. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a chaotic mess. The breaking point came a week later. I was in my office trying to focus on a proposal, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Now." Attached was a photo of Lila and Ethan, taken outside a restaurant I didn't recognize. She was leaning toward him, her expression warm and familiar. My stomach turned as I stared at the image, bile rising in my throat. Whoever had sent the message didn't include their name, but I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who it was. Another message followed. "Meet me at the corner of 5th and Ash. Midnight." The rational part of me screamed that this was a mistake, that I should ignore it and focus on salvaging what little remained of my life. But the anger, the humiliation, the need for answers overpowered my better judgment. I grabbed my coat and keys, leaving the house without a word. The street was deserted when I arrived, the dim glow of a single street lamp casting long shadows. I spotted him immediately, leaning against a lamppost with a cigarette in hand. "Ethan, you got my message," he said, smirking as I approached. I didn't reply. My fists clenched at my sides as I stopped a few feet away, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice low and cold. He shrugged, flicking ash onto the pavement. "Just thought we should clear the air. You've been looking a little stressed lately." The arrogance in his tone pushed me over the edge. Before I realized what I was doing, I lunged at him, shoving him hard against the lamppost. "Stay away from her," I growled, my face inches from his. "You hear me? Stay the hell away from my wife." Ethan's smirk didn't waver. "Funny. You're blaming me for something she wanted just as much as I did." I froze, his words cutting through my fury like a knife. He pushed me back, straightening his jacket and brushing off imaginary dust. "Face it, Alex. You've already lost her," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. I didn't respond. Couldn't. The truth of his words hit harder than any punch ever could. I turned and walked away, the sound of his laughter echoing in my ears. The confrontation with Ethan haunted me for days. His smug laughter and the sting of his words followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of the unraveling mess my life had become. Lila noticed the change in me, but she didn't press. It was as if she knew that any attempt to bridge the growing chasm between us would only make things worse. I thought I'd reached my breaking point, but the universe had other plans. Started with a phone call late one afternoon. I was in my office, halfway through drafting a proposal, when my cell buzzed. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. "Hello," I answered, distracted. "Is this Alex Greer?" a woman's voice asked. Her tone was sharp, businesslike. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Julia Parker. I'm Ethan Cross's ex-wife." The words hit me like a slap. I straightened in my chair, suddenly very alert. "What do you want?" She sighed, a sound heavy with frustration. "I debated calling you, but you need to know who you're dealing with. Ethan isn't who he pretends to be. He's dangerous, manipulative, and he doesn't care who he hurts." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about his pattern," she said bitterly. "He finds married women, charms them, convinces them they're special. Then he uses them until they're no longer useful. Money, connections, influence, whatever he can get his hands on. And when he's done, he moves on, leaving their lives in shambles." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he's doing it to your wife," she said bluntly. "And if you don't stop him, he'll destroy her. Just like he destroyed me." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me reeling. I stared at the phone, Julia's words echoing in my mind. Was this some kind of sick game? Or was she telling the truth? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Lila slept beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger toward her. Instead, I felt a deep, gnawing worry. The next day I called Julia back. She was hesitant at first, but once I convinced her I wasn't interested in defending Ethan, she began to open up. She told me about their marriage, how he'd swept her off her feet with his charm and ambition, how he'd used her connections to build his career, then discarded her the moment she became inconvenient. "He's brilliant at playing the victim," she said. "Whenever someone catches on to his games, he turns it around on them, makes them look like the villain. He's a master manipulator." Her words painted a picture that was all too familiar. I'd seen the same tactics in Ethan's interactions with Lila, the way he'd drawn her in and made her believe she was the center of his world. But if Julia was right, then Lila was just another pawn in his game. The revelation left me conflicted. Part of me wanted to confront Lila immediately, to force her to see Ethan for who he really was. But another part of me hesitated. If I came at her with accusations, she'd only defend him. Ethan's grip on her was too strong, his influence too insidious. I needed a different approach. I decided to confront Ethan again, but this time on my terms. I arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop far from his usual haunts. He arrived late, as expected, his arrogance palpable as he strolled in and took a seat across from me. "Alex," he said, flashing that infuriating smile. "What's this about? Business or personal?" "Personal," I replied coldly. "I spoke to your ex-wife." For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. He quickly masked it with a laugh. "Julia? Let me guess. She fed you some sob story about how I ruined her life." "She told me the truth," I said, leaning forward. "About your pattern, about how you use people, and about how you're doing the same thing to Lila." His smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Believe what you want, Alex. But if you think you can scare me off, you're wasting your time." "I'm not trying to scare you," I said, my voice steady. "I'm warning you. Stay away from my wife. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done." For a moment, he just stared at me, his mask slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. Then he stood, smoothing his jacket. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alex. You should think carefully about your next move." As he walked out, I felt a mix of triumph and unease. The battle lines had been drawn, but the war was far from over. And I knew that the next move would be his. The days following my confrontation with Ethan were a slow grind of tension and dread. His parting words echoed in my mind, a veiled threat that hinted at more to come. I'd hoped my warning would be enough to keep him at bay, but deep down, I knew men like him didn't back down easily. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the dam finally broke. Lila was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone as she sipped coffee. I sat at the dining table, pretending to read emails but really watching her. The distance between us felt insurmountable, and I could no longer ignore the weight of the truth. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. She looked up, startled. "About what?" I gestured for her to sit across from me. Reluctantly, she obeyed, setting her mug down on the table. "This isn't working," I began, my tone measured but firm. Our marriage is broken, Lila, and I don't think it can be fixed." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "Alex, please, don't say that. We can work through this. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you." I shook my head, the words cutting deeper than I expected. "Love isn't enough, not anymore. You lied to me, Lila. You betrayed me. And every time I look at you, I see him." Tears welled in her eyes. "It's over with Ethan. I swear. I ended it. He means nothing to me." "Then why is he still calling you?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Why do I still feel like he's everywhere? Like he's lingering in every corner of our lives?" She hesitated, her silence confirming what I already knew. I leaned back, the exhaustion of the past weeks crashing over me. "I can't keep living like this," I said quietly. "Always doubting, always wondering when the next lie will surface. This isn't a marriage anymore. It's a war zone." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to take mine. "Please, Alex, don't do this. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't give up on us." I pulled my hand away, the gesture more painful than I expected. "It's too late, Lila. We've both made our choices, and now we have to live with them." That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with every passing moment. I checked into a hotel on the other side of town, the anonymity of the space a strange comfort. As I lay on the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the life I'd lost, the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of betrayal. Relief that I no longer had to carry the unbearable burden of pretending. The next morning, Lila called. I stared at the screen for a long moment before letting it go to voicemail. Her message was tearful, pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I needed space, time to figure out what came next. 2 days later, I received a call from Ethan. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I snapped, my patience thin. "Relax, Alex," he said, his tone infuriatingly casual. "I just thought you should know that Lila reached out to me. Seems she's not taking the breakup very well." Anger flared in my chest. "Stay the hell away from her. Haven't you done enough damage?" He chuckled. "Damage? You're the one who couldn't keep her happy. Don't blame me for stepping in where you failed." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me seething. His words were a calculated jab, designed to inflict maximum pain. But more than that, they confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Ethan thrived on chaos, and he wasn't done with us yet. That evening, Lila showed up at the hotel. I opened the door to find her standing there, her face streaked with tears. "Alex, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't shut me out. I can't do this without you." I stepped aside, letting her in. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. For Ethan. For the lies. For hurting you. I don't know why I did it. I felt so lost, and he made me feel seen." Her confession was raw, unguarded, but it didn't bring me the closure I'd hoped for. If anything, it only deepened the ache in my chest. "I can't trust you anymore, Lila," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "And without trust, there's nothing left." Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. Instead, I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights as the weight of finality settled over me. This was the end, and we both knew it. The divorce process was brutal, a slow, grinding dismantling of the life Lila and I had built together. Even though we both knew it was inevitable, the reality of it hit harder than I expected. Lawyers became our intermediaries, their sterile language carving up assets and memories alike. The house, the cars, the business accounts, everything was reduced to numbers and percentages, a clinical dissection of what had once been our shared world. Lila moved into a small apartment downtown, leaving the house to me. I thought being there alone would be a comfort, but instead, it felt hollow. Every room carried the ghost of our past, a reminder of what we'd lost. Her absence was as loud as her presence had once been, and no amount of rearranging furniture or repainting walls could silence it. The first court hearing was a public spectacle. The whispers of our separation had spread through our social circles, and by the time we arrived at the courthouse, reporters were stationed outside, cameras flashing as we walked past. Lila kept her head down, her sunglasses shielding her eyes, while I maintained a stony expression, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Lila's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman with a commanding presence, laid out her case with precision. She painted Lila as a woman who had made mistakes but was committed to moving forward. My lawyer, equally formidable, countered with the facts of the affair, the betrayal that had shattered our marriage. The courtroom felt like a battlefield, every word a weapon aimed to wound. At one point, Lila was called to testify. She stood at the witness stand, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her vulnerability as she recounted the events that had led us here. When she spoke about Ethan, her tone was remorseful, but it didn't lessen the sting of her words. "I never meant to hurt Alex," she said, her voice breaking. "But I did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I didn't look at her, couldn't. Instead, I focused on the notepad in front of me, the pen in my hand shaking slightly as I gripped it. The final hearing came months later. By then, the anger had dulled, replaced by a weary acceptance. The judge's decision was fair. Lila received a portion of our joint assets, enough to start over, while I retained the house and the majority of our business interests. The verdict was just another formality, a punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful sentence. Afterward, Lila approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She looked tired, her once vibrant energy dimmed by the weight of everything we'd been through. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said quietly, "for all of it. I know that doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it." I nodded, my throat tight. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, the words feeling both genuine and final. She gave a small, sad smile before walking away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I watched her go, the woman I'd once thought I'd spend my life with, now a stranger fading into the distance. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. The business kept me busy, and I began to rediscover pieces of myself that I'd lost in the chaos of my marriage. Friends and family rallied around me, their support a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes felt. As time passed, the pain began to fade. It didn't disappear completely. There were still moments when a familiar song or a forgotten photograph would catch me off guard. But it became manageable, a dull ache instead of a sharp wound. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time it didn't terrify me. I was free to start again, to find a new path, unburdened by the weight of betrayal and regret. The chapter with Lila was over, but my story wasn't. And as I stared out at the fading light, I felt a quiet determination to make the next one better. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.